Hello and welcome back to another whiteboard sessions with myself, Nick Graham. What we're going to talk about today is all things cardiovascular training, cardiovascular system, and how it all works together. So what I've tried to draw up on the board here, I guess, is a bit of a timeline or a schematic to indicate the different intensity levels of training and what goes with that in terms of cardiovascular development and how that ties into types of training. So on the far left-hand side, I've drawn a timeline, a vertical timeline there of percentage of heart rate maximum. So from all the way to the top of 100% of your maximum heart rate, and even potentially above that, all the way down to the bottom of being 10%. Now, in the realistic world, is someone going to work when they're training at 10% of their maximum heart rate? Probably not. So to put it in perspective, if someone's maximum heart rate is 200 beats per minute, being as far down as 10% would obviously only be 20 beats per minute. So no one is going to be alive and kicking probably with 20 beats per minute, but even more importantly, they're definitely not going to be exercising at 20 beats per minute. As we roll across to the right, we have the different colored scales or sections indicating the different training zones. This is real, there are different wording or abbreviations across the globe as to what letters and abbreviations they use, but I'm going to go with what I do know and probably what is used quite commonly in sport in this country, in Australia, and that is training zones being T. We start out at the bottom at T1 and go all the way to the top to T6. So as you can see, in line with that heart rate max percentage, training zone 1, which is aerobic training in nature, is from a very low intensity up to give or take around 50% of heart rate maximum. So if you were to put it in layman's terms, if someone was not able to actually monitor their heart rate based on, say, using a heart rate strap or a watch, you would be talking about someone that is able to continue this aerobic based training for long periods of time, not getting out of breath. It would be something along the lines of, say, walking or jogging for long periods of time, in excess of hours, or getting into the multiples of hours. So think about our ability to walk. It shouldn't be, if we're relatively fit, it shouldn't be a challenge for us to be able to do that from an aerobic standpoint for long periods of time. We would probably get soreness in areas before we get out of breath. Our next training zone is training zone 2. So it's also aerobic in nature, and it is taking us up to roughly, give or take, in all different humans, around about 70% of heart rate maximum. It is aerobic in nature, so it does require oxygen to produce energy. There is no lactic acid being produced in this aerobic training zone. So if you are working in training zone 1 and training zone 2, up to 70% of heart rate maximum, then if it is true, you will not be and should not be producing lactic acid in your muscles. The fuel that we use as we roll across to the right in this training zone is carbohydrates, which is our desired fuel source, and fat. So it is a slower process to turn fat into glucose or carbohydrate for us to use at the muscle, at the source. It is a complex system that undertakes, and this is not for this lecture, but the sheer nature that it has to go through a process hopefully makes sense as to why it takes longer. Therefore, we will utilize our carbohydrates, which are much quicker to use than we would use fats. But because we are not doing anything really, really high in nature, in terms of intensity levels, being aerobic in training zone 1 and training zone 2, then we don't need instant drive at the muscles like we do in an explosive activity, say like a sprint or a jump. Then we can afford for our energy to take a little bit longer for it to be utilized, and therefore we can actually utilize some fat as that fuel source. Yes, it takes a lot longer for it to turn into the energy that we require at the muscles, but it actually has a huge return on investment. So the amount of energy that we yield from 1 gram of fat is exponentially bigger than what we can get from other types of fuel sources. As we go up that intensity line on the left-hand side, we get to training zone 3. So we're talking about the onset of lactic acid has just started, up to around about 85%. So as we increase in our intensity, as you know, as a training individual, then you will start to increase more and more lactic acid as the intensity increases. So as we get up towards the end of training zone 4 and we start getting into training zone 3 and into training zone 4, we are now working anaerobically. So we are actually able to utilize fuel within muscles, within bloodstreams, from a source being carbohydrates, and we are actually starting to produce lactic acid. As we increase the intensity, the training type needs to change. If we go back down to, sorry to digress, but as we go back down to the lower intensity, the aerobic type training, in training zone 1 and training zone 2, you'll see on the far right hand side that it says low intensity, long duration. Now, right down the bottom in training zone 1, it can be really long duration and really low intensity. That is known as steady state cardio. And it is fantastic for being able to build our base of aerobic capacity. So overall base fitness, build the base, build the aerobic capacity. As we get above the dotted line, which is the dotted line symbolizing we are now producing lactic acid, the training style does change, as does the utilization of different fuel sources, or we start to take away the utilization of fat as a fuel. We don't metabolize that into energy because it's too slow, and we need energy really, really quick as the intensity increases. You've got in there in red the training zone of death. Now, what that is in reference to is not if you train in training zone 3 and you're starting to accumulate some lactic acid, you're not going to keel over. We're talking about that it's probably not the most efficient way to train our cardiovascular system. It's a bit of a no man's land, so to speak. As we go up into training zone 4, training zone 5, and training zone 6, training zone 6, if I was to put it in perspective of, say, someone that is racing in an aerobic sport, whether it be something like rowing or running, you actually are working above your racing pace. So you're deliberately manipulating your training to be working at really, really high, crazily high intensity levels, but for really short periods of time on repetition. So the lactic acid that will be accumulated in this type of training is a lot, and it's quite horrible to feel. It's hard to actually break through. You might be okay for the first few repetitions. So it's like HIIT training, or high intensity interval based training, in its purest form being cardiovascular in nature. So if you are, say, doing some running sprint repeats, not to increase your maximum speed, but to actually increase your lactate threshold. So what that means is that if that dotted line was able to go further up in terms of what you can withstand until too much lactic acid has been produced, you have actually increased your aerobic fitness. Now, more so, you've actually increased your anaerobic fitness, but overall cardiovascularly, you are fitter. anaerobic threshold, your ability to withstand and continue training at that high intensity level, is in fact, yes, the anaerobic threshold. If you can increase your anaerobic threshold, you are going to be able to perform better in your sport. Okay, in that training zone 4, training zone 5, it is a difficult training zone, and it is the sort of things where you might be doing anywhere from, say, 3 to 8 minute pieces of cardiovascular training at high intensity. It is quite horrible. It is for the more advanced. You need to be able to withstand longer durations than the very, very, very top training zone 6, but nowhere near as long a duration as the aerobic type of training. You are going to accumulate more and more lactic acid. You have to withstand more and more lactic acid being produced. So it's definitely going to be durations of anywhere from about 2 through to 8 minutes is the recommended dosage. Give yourself ample rest in between these bouts. If it's a longer bout, i.e. 8 minutes, and you need to have substantial rest in between before going back and doing another bout. There is no guideline saying that it has to be 4 minutes or it has to be 8 minutes. There are some guidelines about how much you should accumulate of high intensity based lactic acid threshold type training. There are some theories of it being about 36 minutes per session, and how you break that up is completely up to you. You could do 36 bouts of 1 minute on, 1 minute off. That would be very difficult, it'd actually be quite horrible, but it would actually elicit the response that you're after. Okay, so in summary, in snapshot, lower intensity training, build the base, build the aerobic capacity, the overall size of the engine. As we go up into the anaerobic, a great analogy to think about is how high can you rev your engine. So having a big engine is great, but if you can't rev it very high, if your lactate threshold is not very high, then you're not going to be able to perform as well as you possibly could be in your sporting activity or in your own personal fitness journey. I hope that is helpful. Hopefully that is beneficial. Again, it is just another Whiteboard Wednesday. Enjoy, and I'll speak to you next time around.